Doug Morrison, Business Development for SUSE. We also have our Vice President for Defense here out in our booth. Next slide. This is all about delivering a capability to land forces, looking at multi-domain operations and how we make those most effective and most efficient, especially in a theater such as Indo, Asia Pacific. Next chart. This is a brief agenda that I'll follow. The key focus will be on the benefits from the composite rubber track solution that we provide, as well as looking at robotics and autonomous systems that are going to take a increased role in operations in the future. Next slide, please. So what is a composite rubber track solution? It is a continuous solution kit, if you will. At the top of the chart, you can see it's not just the track, but it's also a split idler and a half sprocket, if you will. We also can work with road wheels, the tensioner, etc. But also I'd like to emphasize that it is a composite structure. A lot of folks will say that it's a rubber track or it's a rubber band track, what have you. It's not. It's a continuous composite design. The composite structure is about 52% or so of the solution. That includes about a mile of steel cord, steel mesh, polymers, polymer stiffeners, and those sorts of things. And then the rubber construct is about 48%, 49%. But it's not just plain rubber. It is a series of rubber compounds. For example, the internal structure of that track, where heat is generated, we would have a specially designed rubber compound that is of low heat generation to keep the hysteresis down. The external facing, for example, would have a construct of a rubber compound along with aramid elastomer, pulp, if you will, Kevlar pulp, and carbon nanotubes to help reduce the chip, cut, and fraying of the rubber, as well as reducing the heat generation. Next chart. This shows you the development of this type of track construct over time. You can also see the slope of the curve over the last 10 years or so has been pretty steep as the internal research and development efforts, the IRAD of SUSE, has been focused on increasing durability and increasing the ability of the composite rubber track solution to handle heavier combat vehicles. We're looking to have, in cooperation with the U.S. Army Research Lab, by the end of next year, a prototype at the 50 metric ton or about the 53 U.S. ton weight limit between 6 and 7 road wheel stations. Next chart. So this is kind of the historical development, everything that has occurred over the last 40 years or so in terms of combat vehicle development with composite rubber track solutions. From a U.S. Army perspective, AGS, the Armored Gun System from the early 90s, the Future Scout Vehicle Tracer System with the UK, late 90s, early 2000s, and then of course the Future Combat System program of about 10 or 15 years ago. Currently fielded on the CV90 in Sweden at about 35 metric tons, also on several prototype vehicles, including the Mobile Protected Firepower for the United States Army that's in EMD currently. And we continue to look forward in terms of robotic combat systems, as well as in the case of the U.S., the optionally manned fighting vehicle in the future, and future developments of infantry fighting vehicles around the world. Next chart. So these are some of the challenges for the customer, the operations force that we see, and how we can help deal with those challenges. Everything from survivability to improved stability and reduced vibration for sensors, sensor packages. Reducing the logistics burden becomes especially important as we operate at reach with multi-domain operations. And then, of course, reduced to low to no maintenance, especially if we're talking about robotic combat systems that are optionally manned or that are fully robotic and autonomous systems. Next chart. So these are some of the advantages. Based on a 3,000-mile, 5,000-kilometer trial done with the UK Army about a year and a half ago, significant reductions in noise, vibration, improvements in fuel efficiency, anywhere from 20 to 25% or more, and reduced weight, upwards of about 50% when you compare a steel track to a composite rubber track solution. Next chart. These are some of the specific results from that UK trial done on a Warrior combat vehicle, infantry fighting vehicle, 6 road wheel stations at approximately 35 metric ton solution. You can see the vibration and noise reduction, thermal signature, fuel efficiency of about 25%, which allows you to either reduce your sustainment burden, which can be important in a theater such as Indo-Asia Pacific, or increasing the operational reach using a relatively stable sustainment burden. Next chart. Amphibious operations critical for this theater. Composite rubber track solutions can be optimized for amphibious operations. We'll have a trial with the U.S. Marine Corps later this year on the amphibious assault vehicle. Reduced buoyancy, improved water handling capability, as well as the other capabilities in terms of fuel efficiency and that sort of thing, which is helpful from a sustainment perspective in amphibious operations and littoral operations. Next chart. So when we look at robotic and autonomous systems, low to no maintenance, for sensor packages that we would want to have on those systems to increase the depth and space that we have for the formations, you can see that the vibration is significantly reduced, and that's important, especially when we look at thermal and other FLIR systems. Less susceptible to blast. Our composite rubber track solutions are survivable up to STANAG 3, and if we look at STANAG 4, so about 10 kilograms of explosive, the damage that we would see is probably similar to what you'd see with a steel track equipped system. And a key emphasis would be on the increased reach or longer reach, given the improved capability for those robotic systems to operate at reach. Next chart. So these are some of the systems that we are on currently right now. You'll see one from Pratt & Miller called the Expeditionary Robotic System. Is a developmental program for the Marine Corps. It was also part of the Army Robotics RCV rodeo just this past week, I believe, in Texas. We've also got a couple of other systems that are under development to include work with the Ground Vehicle Systems Center using M113s as surrogate vehicles. Next chart. So why SUSI? SUSI has 2 key components that make its system somewhat unique and optimal for maneuver on multi-domain type operations. One is it's the rubber compounding intellectual property that it owns. SUSI has its own internal research and development for rubber compounding. The trackpad that you see on the right, that's an Abrams trackpad, is with the SUSI-Prene compound. It's a trademark compound using Kevlar elastomer and carbon nanotubes. And the trackpad on the left is the one for the standard Army trackpad. In addition to that, SUSI has a unique manufacturing capability for a continuous composite system. Those 2 capabilities together give you a unique capability for composite rubber track solutions for combat vehicles. Next chart. This is just one chart that kind of captures all of those capability attributes that we think are important: reduce noise and vibration, improve fuel efficiency, reduce life cycle maintenance. A comparison to a 113 track or a Bradley track, T161 track, relatively similar in cost, but over life cycle time, you're not replacing track pads or end connectors or center guides and that sort of thing, so it is a better value with increased capability. Next chart. It's the design, the manufacturing capability, and the continued internal research and development that makes SUSI able to deliver those capabilities for multi-domain operations and enhancing our land forces. Thank you very much. We have a booth outside if you have any questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Colonel Morrison, for a very interesting capability. As you said, just outside, so take some opportunity at the next break to go visit Susie and learn a little bit more about that great capability. If I could ask now our next panel to come up to the stage and take your seats. We heard a lot this morning from General Brown and from our first panel about the joint aspects of multi-domain operations, and particularly as applied in the Indo-Pacific theater. And so our next panel is designed to specifically address that, joint force contributions to multi-domain operations. And we have a decidedly first corps flavor to this to this panel. And for those of you who aren't questioning, it is first corps. Some of us have been reminded in previous iterations, if you say I Corps, General Volesky and General Dubik will quickly remind you that the United States Army has numbered corps, not lettered. So our panel chair is the current Commanding General of the 1st United States Corps, Lieutenant General Gary Volesky, and our moderator, a former commander of that great corps, America's Corps, Lieutenant General retired Jim Dubik, who now serves as a United States Army, or as a senior fellow at our Association of the United States Army. Please welcome our second panel for this morning. Gentlemen,
well, General Ham, thank you very much, and General Brown, too. This panel will talk about multi-domain operations, concept to reality, both sides, not just the concept and the idea, but how this concept is being worked out through the variety of activities here in the Indo-Pacific theater. The panel is, I think, well disposed to talk about both the concept and the reality, and to talk about things that are yet to be worked out. The panel is not as large as the first panel. Each of us will speak, excluding me, for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll entertain questions. So I would ask you to start generating your questions early, get them on up here, and we can have the appropriate conversation between the experts on the panel and those of us who are trying to learn about it. So with no further ado, Gary, over to you.
Sir, thank you, and I'd like to thank General Ham and all of AUSA for allowing us to speak about multi-domain operations. We just say, as America's First Corps Commander for the last 2 years, we've been tasked by the United States Army to lead the effort for the concept employment of the multi-domain task force and how that applies to multi-domain operations. And so over the last few years, we've had the opportunity to participate in a number of joint exercises to really flesh out the program and the concept. And I'll talk for a few minutes about that. So if I go to the first slide, what you see here is kind of the framework that we look at when we talk about multi-domain operations capability throughout competition to conflict. And I just show you this as how we visualize this concept as we execute this in a multi-domain environment. So the first thing you see on the left side of the slide is the compete through conflict diagram that we've got. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the competition piece, because I think as General Wesley and I talked about earlier, we default to the conflict phase too quickly, and we don't really understand necessarily what key things have to happen in competition so that if you don't deter your adversary, you've set the conditions to seize initiative or at least maintain momentum should conflict break out. And so as you look at the competition component of that, you see that we've kept the joint phasing construct below on phase 1 and 2 and 3, as you see. But we really want to focus in competition on, the development or conducting operational preparation in the environment, because that's going to enable us to really do a number of things. First is identify those critical capabilities and vulnerabilities and requirements that the adversary may have, that we may have to target in the conflict phase, and it allows us to build what we call the multi-domain tasking order. Many of you are used to or are familiar with the term air task order, 96-hour window. In our execution of this concept, what we've realized is a multi-domain tasking order is going to start with effects that may not be from a land or a maritime or air domain, but in the cyber or space domain. And those may take weeks, if not months, to get into position to enable you to transition to a conflict phase. And so this multi-domain tasking order is what you're going to develop, that it's going to enable you to go and really target capabilities in that conflict phase. The other piece that we realized during our last exercise is this is not just a joint construct. This is really about the GIM environment. And as we've all deployed, we've had what we call a POLAD officer that helps us with the diplomacy piece. We just got done with Joint Warfighting Assessment here a few weeks ago, and during the competition excursion that we did, I realized I did not have the whole of government representation that I would have needed if we were doing this in a real operation. The diplomacy and the risk and the authorities that reside in that diplomatic line are absolutely essential to make sure that you can leverage as you go to deter an adversary and conduct operations short of conflict to prevent you from going to conflict. And a lot of those authorities reside at the national level, and you're not going to get those in competition. And so having that whole of government representation in your headquarters as you go through the competition phase in multi-domain operations is absolutely essential. I would also say that your multinational partners in competition are going to bring capabilities that you don't have. So for example, when I was in my previous job in Iraq, my deputy commanding officer was an Australian, and they had more cyber authorities than I had from a U.S. component. And so our multinational partners in this endeavor are absolutely critical because they bring capabilities and authorities that we may not have that we can leverage in competition as we transition, if required, to go to conflict. So as you look at the competition piece, this is what we want to get out of that. And go to the next slide. So what we realized in the execution of JWA is we don't target things anymore. We have to target networks. And so as you look at this A2AD construct, you see N-access at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. And so what we want to do in the operational preparation of the environment and competition is start to identify all those critical nodes. And those nodes enable us to build that high payoff target list if we transition to competition or conflict. And so you look at the left side, while the adversary is on his home turf, we're still collecting those intel indicators that allow us to build out that network that we're going to have to strike if we go to conflict. And what we realized is we rely on space and cyber capabilities more than we ever have, because you're not going to have necessarily the access to be able to go define that with your own organic or even your higher level headquarters. And so how you leverage space and cyber in the competition phase is absolutely essential to establishing that MDO problem network set that you're going to engage in competition to conflict. And then as you transition into conflict and the adversary starts to deploy his forces across the strategic, operational, and tactical echelons, you'll be able to start to look at where those critical nodes are that you're going to have to degrade or eliminate to give you the momentum. What we want to do here is, normally in the way that we go about fighting, the enemy always has the first opportunity to strike. What this will enable us to do is, if we do it the proper way, is set that multi-domain tasking order so that once we transition to conflict, we can generate some momentum so that we're not having to fight to regain the initiative. And if you'd like to talk at the questions and answer times about how we break that node down and engage it through multi-domain effects, I'd be happy to answer those. I'll be followed by Major Killo.
Well, good morning. I'm Major General Brian Killo. I'm the PACAF Chief of Staff here in Hawaii and across the Indo-Pacific region. I would like to say thanks as well to General Ham and to the AUSA for allowing me to be a part of the panel. It's pretty intimidating, I have to say. It's the first time I've been able to speak in front of an AUSA crowd, and so I was a little worried about it. And our version of the command sergeant major, my command chief, said, "Sir, just remember, every time they say HUA, they're saying heads up air power." So I'm ready now. HUA. When our Chief of Staff of the Air Force took over a couple of years back, he established 3 big rocks, 3 focus areas he was going to really put a lot of attention to throughout his term as the chief. And one of those was the multi-domain command and control. And he saw from the very beginning, from his time as a JFAC, from his time as a commander, how important it was to make sure that we were integrating multi-domain operations in a command and control kind of arena. And so that has followed throughout, and I'll speak a little bit to that as I go through my remarks. But to follow on to Lieutenant General Valesky's comments on the competition phase, one of the things we've noticed is we've put more emphasis on that, not only from a GEM perspective, but across the theater is, are we establishing and understanding what the end state is that we want to get to in the competition phase to keep us out of that conflict? And then how are we establishing the measures of effectiveness to get there and measuring it? Because it's one thing to go measures of performance. I flew this many sorties, I did this task list, but it's quite another thing in the competition phase to figure out whether you're being effective or not, short of going into conflict. So I would open that up for any additional questions to go along with that. One of my previous jobs was Director of Strategy for the Air Force, and so as we looked at the future of warfare, it was very clear to us that it was going to be fast, lethal, and contested in all environments and all domains. And in order to achieve success as a joint force to do what the Department and the nation asks of us, we have to not only integrate, we have to not only deconflict or synchronize, we've got to synergize, and we've got to do it faster than our adversaries do. So that's a matter of getting that synergy of capabilities to disrupt and prevent the adversary from achieving his OODA loop and to keep him guessing, to keep his calculus off. And to do that, we've got to be closer as a joint force throughout the multi-domain operations. As we go into our multi-domain command and control across all domains, we've always tried to do that. We've talked about it as an Air Force. We have an Air Operations Center that is inherently joint, that tries to get those effects synchronized. But the specific focus of MDC2 was to synchronize across air, space, and cyberspace to begin with. But it also had to have the hooks and the capability to then build in the surface and subsurface components as well in order to be able to do the command and control across all domains. And that includes a networked sensor grid and effects grid. And it does not matter what domain the effects are generated from, whether that's cyber, or whether that's from a surface fires, or whether that's from airborne fires. The main effect is to bring them all together integrated for the Joint Force Commander. And then finally, we have to be an agile force. So that force that is able to move more rapidly than the enemy can target. And so we have focused on, in PACAF, working on the agile combat employment. How do we go using a hub and spoke or hub and web system, much like the web that was shown up on one of the earlier slides, to create a targeting problem for our adversary and keep them off balance. And so as we are going forward as an Air Force, the things that we're doing to contribute to that MDC2 effort is a project called Kessel Run, which is looking at how do we improve the AOC and make that a networked system of systems versus being a physical place where 1,000 people sit. Because right now, I'll tell you that in the warfare of the future, that AOC is much too juicy a target, especially when we have adversaries out with hyperglide vehicles and other types of effects to bring to bear on those kind of things. We've instituted a new Air Force Specialty Code, or I'll speak Army MOS, called the 13 Oscars, which will take operators out of the operational fields that they have been brought up in after their first 10 years and move them over to be command and control specialists for the next 10 years through multiple tours in our AOCs across the world. And then I talked briefly about the agile combat employment, and then we also are the lead MAGCOM for the multi-domain command and control doctrine that's being written as well. So how do we apply that? We've got an exercise going on right now called Northern Edge. Many of you know about it up in Alaska. It's got integrating ops and effects across airspace, cyber, and then surface, as well as I'll blend in electronic warfare and information operations as well. 10,000 people, over 200 aircraft, 11 ships, trying to solve some of these hard problems of this integration where we have those seams and gaps between our services and our capabilities and the way we synchronize going forward. So with that, I'll stop and turn my time over to my compadre right here, General Morrison.
Who will never say "who" again, because I now know it means air power.
Exactly.
General Ham, it's great to see you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And it does my heart well to hear the operators talking about multi-domain operations like they are, because one of the key themes that I would like to leave you with is it really is commander's business, and it is a new way of fighting. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see where we're at today, conducting multi-domain operations, and then sort of give you a snapshot specifically from the cyberspace and the electronic warfare perspective on where our Army is heading in the future, so that we really do get after these integrated capabilities, these integrated formations that will deliver these integrated effects that really gets after the synergy that our distinguished colleague from the Air Force just talked about. So where are we at today with multi-domain operations? The reality of it is we do multi-domain operations today, each and every day. But what we don't do is do it at the speed that we will need to do it against a near-peer competitor. We also don't have it integrated and synchronized on echelon like we think that we're going to need to in the future as you start thinking about large-scale combat operations. And so it really is about the integration, not the synchronization, the speed of which we will need to be able to act, and then how do you echelon those effects across the battle space, not just at the theater level with something like the multi-domain task force, but all the way down to the edge. Because if you don't have that layered effect, you're probably not going to get that synergy that you really want to in a domain that is so contested and so congested. That's really going to be fundamentally how we're going to have to change things as we think about competition. Because right now, we are not aligned to leverage cyberspace across the broad spectrum that is the Army and the Joint Force during the competition phase. And we're going to have to think through how do we align authorities so that it's not just at the strategic level that we're able to do that operation, preparation of the environment that General Valesky was describing, but how do you push that down so now when you turn to conflict where you might actually have to be applying either kinetic or non-kinetic effects, you can rapidly turn that on. That is going to have to be a completely different model of how we've looked at authorities in the past, and it's going to have to be flexible so that as the environment starts to change, we're able to adjust those authorities so they're not held so high that we can't conduct multi-domain operations at speed across the entire formation and down towards the edge. Again, it warmed my heart hearing General Valesky talk about this, because what we don't want to have happen is cyberspace is treated as a separate and distinct domain that is not integrated into everything that we're doing from an operational perspective. The commander absolutely must own the cyberspace domain within inside their area of operations. It can't be some tent off the side of the TOC where you have a whole bunch of very, very smart people trying to conduct something and it's not integrated. If not, it was told to me by a very dear friend of mine, they just go off to the land of misfit toys and they are not useful to the commander. The commander's got to own it and then integrate it completely and fully into the targeting process. And that is something that will continue to evolve through the experiments and demonstrations that we have ongoing. But it really is about making sure the commander can apply the effects that they want at the time and place of his or her choosing. It's got to be natural. It's got to be rhythmic. You know, something that is not an afterthought, that is a part of our everyday planning process. We continue to mature in that through a series of experiments, both with the Multi-Domain Task Force and at the Combat Training Center, specifically the National Training Center, with Cyber Support Corps and below rotations. But we've got to instantiate that across all of our formations. So that leads us to where are we really heading? And so multi-domain operations is not something to be held just at the JTF level. It must be enabled all the way down to the edge. So over the next 3 to 5 years, the Army will more than double its cyber space branch. And all of it is being applied for tactical effects. And it's all, again, about these integrated formations, integrated capabilities, all the way down to the edge. So electronic warfare capabilities that are embedded into our current MI companies inside each of our BCTs. An integrated intelligence and electronic warfare capability that will be supporting at the division and corps level. And then obviously linking all the way back to the multi-domain task force that'll be up at the theater level or the JTF. A cyber warfare support battalion owned by Army Cyber that can deploy capabilities that are authorities enabled down to the division level. And then bringing that all together so that you really can conduct multi-domain operations at speed. And that's already ongoing. We've already built the first of the electronic warfare platoons up at Fort Lewis. And it is, again, we're learning through experimentation and demonstration, and soon you will start seeing that applied across the entire Army. Again, layered effects all the way across the battlefield. And with that, I will turn it over to General Wesley.
Thanks, John. So in 1981, General Don Starry, who is the commander of TRADOC, said that if a concept is not embraced by the operational force, it will not survive. So to Gary Valesky, thanks for embracing this at First Corps. The operational force, teaches us a lot, and General Valesky shared some of it here. We'll share some of the insights. Let me back up, though, and just give you some context in terms of why this is important and what we share here as it relates to the joint force contributions to MDO. And we wrote multi-domain operations in 2028. One of the things we want to do is identify a pacing threat, and what is unique to this concept is we're in a world where we have two. And so what we say in the concept is that, and this group knows this better than anyone, and that is China and Russia are different, clearly. But they're sufficiently, the assumption is that they're sufficiently similar that you can build a warfighting concept against it, and that is they identify with the three components of the threat that I described in the last panel. And the first is that multiple layers of standoff. The second is this leveraging the competition space. And then third is challenging us in all domains. And both peer adversaries are doing that in varying degrees. And so I wanted to clear that up front. We know that China and Russia are distinct. So last year, we validated the concept in Europe. And this year, we sought to validate multi-domain operations in the Asia and Indo-PACOM AOR. And so what have we learned as we've gone through that? Well, that's what I'd like to describe to you. I've only got two charts. The first chart up there identifies 6 big areas where we've learned some things. We haven't completed a lot of our analytics with respect to the Joint Warfighter Assessment or the capstone war game that we did in Leavenworth just 2 weeks ago. But certain insights emerge, and the very first issue there that you see is that we have validated the tenets of MDO. If you've read multi-domain operations, there's 3 of them. The first is calibrated force posture, the second is multi-domain formations, and third is this idea of convergence. And if I could quickly describe the first, calibrated force posture, we talked about this in the last panel. The first part of that is force posture, whether permanent or rotational. And we're convinced that over the course of the ensuing years, we're going to have a discussion or a debate at least as to the degree or size of capacity that we'll have to have forward presence. And the degree to which you don't have that, you need the second, and that is expeditionary capacity. And then third is you have to have access to national assets, and that's what General Morrison was just talking about. And then the final one is authorities, and both General Valesky and General Morrison mentioned that. Those 4 components enable you to calibrate your force posture. I won't mention all of them in the interest of time, but I'll take you over to number 4 there, and this is idea of MDC2. General Killow mentioned this. If there is a place where there is zero light between the Air Force and the Army, it is this idea that the number one joint capability requirement that we lack now that we need for multi-domain operations, it's this idea of multi-domain operations command and control. And if you want to know what that is, just in a phrase, and I think the Air Force agrees with this as we worked with AFWIC, any sensor, any shooter from any C2 node in near real time. And when you solve that, you've clearly solved multi-domain C2. Number 5 there, Joint Force Commander requires a Joint Theater Operational Headquarters. General Volesky mentioned that we're not attacking formations or echelons, we're attacking a network or nodes or systems. They're A2AD system. And to get after that, you have to be continually stimulating those sensors and targeting them accordingly in a multi-domain tasking order format. That's got to be happening every single day, and it's not happening on the scale that we need it now. Then number 6 there, a concept, a joint concept. Services have concepts, but until we come up with a joint concept, it will be very difficult to employ multi-domain operations, because unlike air-land battle, where you federated capabilities and then synchronized them for the fight, all the services have to have a common view on, as General Kilo said, what's the purpose, what's the outcome you're trying to achieve in order to integrate the domains at tempo and scale. I'm going to show you one more slide here, and the question for this session was the joint force contributions to multi-domain operations. And this is a conceptual chart, and it shows a gap that we need to discuss, and it's really the force presence gap. If you're talking about the degree to which you can bring intensity to the fight almost immediately with very few days of unambiguous warnings, you can see there's an element of the joint force that you miss in order to create deterrence. And what that shows is the degree to which the Army capabilities can't be employed very rapidly when you go to a rapid transition to conflict, which means you have a difficult time precluding a fait accompli attack. The second point I would make is the whole purpose of A2AD is to keep that gap large, because they want no part of close combat. So forward presence and dynamic force posture and calibrated force posture is all about being able to get a complete joint force to the left at a place where you can bring deterrence. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, panel. Got some good questions, and thank you, the audience, for submitting these. I'll start off first, probably aimed, Eric, at you from your last comment, actually. What's going on with respect to moving the MDO, multi-domain operations concept, forward as a joint concept so that it can help drive experimentation, research and development, and acquisition?
Yeah, thanks, sir. So left to our own devices, that would not be a normal behavior because the services are incentivized to build their own concepts. Fortunately, there's a couple forcing functions out there. One is I think there's an increasing realization as we look at the threat problem that we've got to collaborate. For example, the MDC2 agreement between the Air Force and the Army is not unlike the 31 initiatives back in the early 80s, where the Air Force and the Army collaborated and cooperated because there is a threat that is concerning. The second is Acting Secretary Shanahan has driven this to a degree as a forcing function in requiring us to conduct the globally integrated war game this next fall. And that effort will drive significant amounts of investment, adjustments, or refinements in the amount of billions, I would imagine. And so that becomes a quick forcing function to pull us together. And so there is an effort now on the part of all the services to come together with a CONOP that's consistent with the scenario in Asia that will allow us to validate our service concepts. And in that process, the Army is trying to show that multi-domain operations is a way, and the degree to which the other services can embrace it, it can become a concept.
Great. So this second question.
Yeah, just a second.
Yeah.
And I would say that the other piece that we're working is, we've participated in joint exercises like RIMPAC, where the multi-domain task force went and was under the mission command of the Navy. A lot of it is, as Eric has said, there's some education that has to go on across the joint force about what all the services really mean about multi-domain operations, because as we go talk to the Air Force, we go talk to the Navy, there is still some gaps between how we all see it. And what I've seen is, and joint warfighting assessment kind of led this, is once you get the Navy and the Air Force and the Army in the room with all of the cyber and space professionals, and they really see how they all can contribute, that starts to get a shared understanding. But I think that that experimentation and the outputs of those exercises need to be more widely distributed to inform the force.
Gary, one other point real quick, just so that there's no confusion. Multi-domain operations originated as multi-domain battle. It was a white paper that the Marine Corps and the Army put together. We called it MDB 1.0. We always said we were going to go to a 2.0 version that would either be multi-service or joint, and that was supposed to be the fall of 19. The Army, with this document, does not presume to say that this is the concept or that it's uniquely Army. It's built as a joint suggestion in terms of how the Army fights with plug-ins or gaps that we need the joint force to contribute. So the next step is to cooperate with the services to see where they can fill those gaps.
So let me ask this of anyone on the panel that wants to answer. It has to do with the joint, with the interagency and intergovernmental aspect of multi-domain operations. There's been some criticism that on all the services, but especially the ground forces, who've been emphasizing this whole of government interagency aspect that is based on an illusion that below the strategic level there's not much capacity of the interagency anyway. So the question is, how well do the other agencies and intergovernmental members understand MDO, and how at the tactical and operational level are they actually learning and contributing to this concept?
So I'd lead off and say I think this is a massive gap, and we do all we can to get up on the hill and get to the think tanks. I think that the degree to which we can have think tanks and media publishing on this to force the debate is fundamental. What we can do is submit what we think are policy requirements, but sir, you mentioned a key point, that most of the shaping effort and that will enable us to either be successful or not be successful is left of conflict, which is not the space that the uniformed military is necessarily empowered. And so the degree to which we can get the interagency to either agree to participate at the tactical level or grant authorities to uniformed military in the competition space will determine the degree to which we're successful.
Well, and I think that, you know, as we looked at the competition phase during this last excursion, the risk is held during competition at a much higher level than it is during conflict. And so I think as you look at more and more opportunities to work in this competition space, it will drive the intergovernment and the interagency to come together because of the authorities piece. And it gets back to, we've done this before. I mean, in Iraq in 2009, there was a thing called the Mosul Fusion Cell, where all the three-letter agencies came together. And I didn't need to own that authority, but somebody that sat right next to me had the authority to get at the timing and speed that John Morrison talked about. So I think as we look at competition and we drive that authorities discussion, I think that will just enable us to get more and more participation. But you know, as you know, sir, you know, we've talked about getting more whole of government participation in the current operations that we've been doing and have not been as successful. So that's, as Eric has said, that's a gap that we need to continue to reinforce or continue to push to solve.
So multi-domain operations increases the requirement for coordination among the services and the service components, not just at the theater level, but pretty much down the operational and tactical level. So the question here is, how have the relationships among the KOC, for example, the multi-domain task force, and the JTF commanders, how have these relationships changed, and what kind of things are we learning about ways to deconflict and integrate activities across the spectrum from kinetic to non-kinetic?
I'll take a quick first hack at that, sir. You know, I think we all come from our organizational cultural backgrounds where we bow up and we look at doctrine and we start pointing to the commas and the tittles and the jots in doctrine, and the doctrine is important, but as we started down this road of understanding what the multi-domain task force could do, would do, should do, and how it interacted with existing structures like the AOC, we started seeing how they could be complementary and how they will be have the ability to synergize those effects. It doesn't mean we've solved all the problems. There's a ton of problems out there to solve because there's a limited number of assets. And I think to your point, sir, that or the questioner's point that we're going to run into those conflicts of interest and conflicts of resource shortages between services, and it's really going to come down to how fast can we resolve those and assign priority to achieve the strategic effects for the Joint Force Commander.
I would just say that, as you look at the multi-domain task force, it's not the be-all end-all of MDO. It's just a piece of MDO. And so the more we talk about how every component in every domain enables whatever effect we want to get, and we bring that synchronization and integration more completely into our operations, that will help sort itself out. The challenge we've had is in First Corps is people talk about multi-domain and they automatically want to talk to the I2Qs guys in the multi-domain task force. And I was like, well, in competition, you've got freedom of navigation, you've got the Air Force doing things, you got multinational partners that are out there building that network. Should be a multi-domain GIM and effort, not just a task force. So I think the more we focus on integrating all of those domains collaboratively, I think we'll get after that problem.
One of the like I said earlier, one of the tenets of multi-domain operations is multi-domain formations. And what we mean by that is not to imply that a brigade commander is going to be manipulating satellites by any means, but we say they have to be able to think, access, and employ all domains in order to create that overmatch. And that's the reason you need a multi-domain concept at the joint level as a forcing function, and the degree to which you've got a top-down forcing function for investments, we'll have a difficult time getting there.
And the only thing that I would add on top of that, and it ties back to the need for a joint concept, is if you don't have those integrated capabilities at the joint level, you're not going to have the common situational understanding that you need to operate in some of these domains that change at the snap of a fingers. And so we've all got to have the same sight picture so that we can really go ahead and get the integrated effects across the entire joint force that we want.
Right, and we can pursue those condition-based authorities that are required for the speed and accuracy that we need to get after it, and then we can train together on it.
If you go to the third slide that we had that breaks down it says multi-domain effects. I just want to show this because it gets after what the team has done here. It's one of the nodes that we looked at JWA. Can you bring that slide up?
I think he's working.
It was on an IADS node that we were targeting in the exercise, and when you looked at all the critical components of that node, there were about 4 that we had to target to degrade it to a sufficient level to enable us to penetrate the A280 bubble. And of the 3 that we had to penetrate, every component in every domain was represented. So if you look at those multi-colors there, you can see it's not just a land component, it's not just the maritime. So that when we looked at the shape component of the effects we wanted to get out before we hit this target at H hour, all of those capabilities we had to bring to get at the conversion that Eric was talking about required us to synchronize all of those effects over time and space to get that effect at the appropriate time. So if you look at this and say that's how we got to target in the future, you'll never go out there saying, well, this is a one-domain fight. This is a multi-domain fight if you're going to get after the adversary the way we need to, especially in near peer.
Just to reinforce the complexity of that, if I could, Gary, General Townsend actually says this best. We're doing multi-domain operations now, but we do so episodically. And you might take weeks or months to try to line up domains, and the effects last maybe a day, 2 or 3 days. We have to do it rapidly and continuously, as General Morrison said earlier, which means you've got to change your approach to targeting, but it'll also probably require artificial intelligence augmentation.
Absolutely.
So there are several great questions on the next topic, and again, I want to thank the audience for submitting so many good ones. The question has to do about learning, and learning at the intra-theater level, what's going on in Indo-Pacific theater. How are we learning from each other and from the exercises you're talking about to feedback and improve? Second, what kind of intra-service learning and organizations are beginning to emerge to reflect the realities that, Gary, you talked about in terms of organizations and processes, in terms of new capabilities, and in terms of authorities that really have to be rethought or rewritten?
That's a heck of a question.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, I'll just start with the exercises that we've done as we talked about going to RIMPAC and having the multi-domain task force operate directly for Third Fleet. And in the maritime domain, what capabilities they could bring from a land, a cyber, and space component. And so that first exercise enabled us to get some lessons learned of how we operate with the maritime component. But when you look at, as we talked about a little bit earlier, how every component or service sees the way they prosecute the fight is a little bit differently. So we had a very passionate discussion about, in the maritime domain, how the land and the cyber and space could enable their operations. And so sharing those with Third Fleet and Seventh Fleet enabled us to start the process of, in Indo-PACOM, to say, hey, America's First Corps can bring this capability to talk about multi-domain operations. I will tell you, in the competition phase in the theater, when we go on exercises or I go meet with our great partners out in the Indo-Pacific region, they are all focused on multi-domain operations. And as I started, a lot of them bring capabilities and authorities that we don't have. And so I had one of my partners say, you know, we're a lot smaller than you. We're just glad to be here. I said, but here's all the things you bring that I don't have. And so you're just as critical as you know, the United States is in enabling us to get after this adversary. So I think engagements with our partners to really understand what capabilities they bring to the fight across all of their domains that they have, as well as continuing interoperability exercises with our other components. And as Eric said, getting after this joint concept that everybody comes together with what we've learned out of this pilot to say, what's the next step for multi-domain across the joint force?
Yeah, I'd highlight 4 areas, some of which you talked about, Gary. But first is the operational force. Again, as I opened up, and that's the operational force, because we don't have a formation in Futures Command, and so you need to put this thing in the dirt. So the multi-domain task force effort largely informed the concept that we wrote and the chief signed on 6 December. USER, when they conducted JWA the year before, largely informed that document. So operational force. Second, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff just directed us to develop an MDC-2 solution with the Air Force facilitating. So we're learning right now what they've experimented with out at the Shadow C2 node out at Nellis Air Force Base. The third is, you mentioned partners and allies. Our Australian friends have informed significantly how you get after the information realm, and we've leveraged that. And the last one I mentioned is the private sector. Anduril, I think, is a key enabler to the Air Force and also to us in terms of how you put together some kind of artificial intelligence web to communicate prioritization of targets.
So this one, mostly to John, I think. Disinformation has been seen to be a pretty effective capacity, at least at the strategic level. And the question is, how is disinformation at the tactical and operational level being thought about or experimented with in the Cyber Center of Excellence?
Yeah, thanks for that, sir. So we're not yet. But I'll just give you a sense for where we're really starting to head. And it's really this whole concept of information warfare, especially during that period of competition. And what I think you will start to see here over the next few months, and I don't want to get ahead of decision makers, but you'll start seeing that fusion of the information environment and those capabilities that go and support it with cyber and electronic warfare so that we can really start wrapping our arms around what is this idea of information warfare. Now, what I will tell you, it's a great example of what we've learned from the multi-domain task force experimentation and demonstration so far, because initially it wasn't called information and intelligence, cyber electronic warfare, really should be 2S, it's signal and space. But information was added in because we were learning by doing. That's driving this notion of we've got to establish the proponency at one place that gets after this notion of information warfare. And I think that we'll continue to leverage things like the multi-domain task force to get after that. But we're also going to expand that because there's that notion of you've got to have these abilities to apply these effects up and down and across the battle space. So it's not just an MDTF solution that we've got to look at. Again, it's building off those integrated formations that we've gotten some great support from FORSCOM to start building. And what capabilities objectively do we need to have in them? And again, experimentation and demonstration is going to take us to the right answer.
Let me leverage that. Oops, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add in that besides the cyber domain, which is incredibly important, I think we over the last 30 years have been lulled into a sense of security by being predominant powers around the world in whatever conflict we've gone into. And so we've let go some of those capabilities for camouflage, concealment, and deception that link right into that information operations campaign and allow us to do that quote, disinformation to the adversary. And I think, I know as far as the Air Force is concerned, we've started to pick that back up, but we're behind.
No, well, thanks, Brian. What I was going to get ready to say was leveraging my own experience in Bosnia. When John, you and I were there were several times when our adversaries put out a version of an event that was absolutely false, but caused us a lot of consternation. So I wondered if that kind of thing, first, that kind of situation are what you're talking about, and second, have we incorporated any of that into our exercise program to help commanders learn and react to that?
It's fundamental to the competition space because, again, both our peer adversaries leverage it in a significant manner. And we can look at our own elections, we can look at Brexit, we can look at Catalonia, a number of examples at the international level where this is prevalent. But you could also look at it with respect to Chris Cavoli. His counterpart is doing these things in Europe all the time. We will have to be able to get into that space. The problem is we find it unattractive, or the authorities to counter it quickly resides at such a level that you can't. That's why we keep talking about the authorities issue. But sir, to your question, that is a fundamental component of the competition space and being willing to compete aggressively.
And I think the other gap we have is, we look at open source intelligence and how we are out there and manned to do that. I think that's a clear gap in our swing to be able to see the environment that's out there. I think we get locked into classified means, and we don't look at what's right out in front of us. As you said, sir, I doubt that was on SIPR that came out. It was out in the open space, and I think that's one of the gaps we have. We got to get better at. It's really how are you assessing open source intelligence?
We got several questions about the left of conflict phase and how difficult this is for us to really operate and succeed in. One of the questions had to do with organizational adaptations or capabilities. The example was linguistic support that might be available or might be necessary to develop very quickly in left of conflict. And the second had to do with our allies and partners. Left of conflict, we want to seize the initiative. But are we seeing any problem with balancing seizing the initiative from the U.S. perspective, and maybe some of our partners being reluctant for good strategic reasons of not wanting to be as aggressive because of their own national policies or agitating a relationship that they may want to develop later on?
Yeah, I'll just start and say that's the reason we're doing Pacific Pathways 2.0. And what we found was Pathways, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is USRPAC's plan to really engage inside the Pacific that General Brown talked about earlier. And what we were doing originally was just going to countries for exercise purposes. Pathways 2.0, starting next year, we're going to put U.S. forces in the Pacific for 10 months of the year. And it's not tied to telling them what they want to do. We're going out there and really building relationships and conducting operations with those countries that don't want to do decisive action. Humanitarian assistance, disaster response is the thing that's their critical requirement. So we're going out and engaging with them. So I think that just our ability to be in the environment, in the region longer is going to help us get after that part. Eric mentioned the ability to have a forward presence, to be that response force. Pathways 2.0 is one of the things we've learned that we need to do to be forward postured and readily able to do that. I think that, we're starting to engage with countries that we haven't engaged before. We went to Palau here just a few weeks ago, and we hadn't been to Palau in a while. And so I think as we start to build more, visibility in the region for a longer term, I think that's going to help get after some of what you're talking about, sir.
I kick in with, a lot of what we're dealing with is understanding cultures and understanding our adversaries. We've focused on the global aspect of all our responsibilities for so long that sometimes I think we've forgotten that you have to learn that war is a human endeavor, and we have to know our opposite counterparts as well. And so understanding how they think and what they're saying about the way they perceive us is just as important as understanding our capabilities to do anything about it. And so as we are in that competition phase, are we as a service as the Air Force, are you as a service as the Army, and so on, are you looking at that? Are you reading the things that are being written by our potential adversary commanders? There's that great scene out of Patton where he goes, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book," right? And how many of us are reading the Eastern Military District Commanders' books and understanding what they're thinking about as they prepare for conflict? And so I'll just leave it there and say that's a professional responsibility we don't get after enough.
So we got a couple of questions on technologies, and one specific concerning low Earth orbit constellation as a possible way to make our networks more survivable and more robust. And the second had to do with adaptations to the acquisition system to keep abreast of the developing capabilities that are available that right now that we need to buy.
Leo.
So just a couple thoughts. So first off, we need a fundamental change in how we've approached network technologies in the past. And there are commercial constellations that are coming on board, LEO, low Earth orbiting satellites, that provide us a really unique opportunity. Other technologies such as 5G from a terrestrial perspective that allow us not to have to build military unique systems, but leverage what is out there for far more bandwidth, throughput, and quite frankly, in some cases, security than we have today. That is something that we're going to need to be focused on. And again, through this experimentation and demonstration, figure out what the right mix is, because you can never go too far to the right where it's solely commercial, and we should never ever, because we've already learned that just through the last 17 years of conflict, you can never go too far to the left on it being solely military, because you'll never have enough capacity. So there's a balance that we're going to have to work our way through. The key is a network that's able to plug into just about anything, and then have the survivability, resiliency, and security that allow you to conduct military operations. If you don't mind, I will touch on the cyber piece. From a cyber perspective, from a network perspective, from just about anything, I will tell you the traditional acquisition approach simply will not work. It just cannot keep up with the pace of change that you see in an environment that you can't project 5 years out what capability you're going to want. We can talk big ideas, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but we don't know where technology is going to take us. Quite frankly, nobody can tell you what the next iPhone 12 is really going to look like. And that's a good thing. We've got to leverage that innovation. So the acquisition system must change, and that's from requirements all the way through the delivery of a capability where you never ever get to the end state of that capability. I'm just going to give you one quick anecdote. The traditional acquisition process to get a requirement approved is about 500 plus some odd days. That won't work. So You turn around and you change that model and you get something approved in about 60 days. Prototypes show up in a unit about 60 days after that. Your fielding capability is about 3 months after that. And then you turn around the next year, you're fielding something else. Well, that's the reality of what's happening as we've turned the tables on the requirements and the acquisition process for cyber. And that's literally what has been fielded inside the Army. And oh, by the way, we've cut costs by almost 2/3 and providing capability that's almost 8 times better than what we had fielded previously. If we don't have that kind of adaptive and learning model, we will not be successful in cyber.
Just make a couple comments on this. First is, I heard somebody say once that if the utility of the technology you're pursuing is less than the length of the program of record, you've probably got a bankrupt model. And that's what General Morrison's talking about here, and so we've got to be cognizant of that. That's the reason the Army Futures Command was established, frankly, because all of the elements of the acquisition system transcended the enterprise. So there was no single source or single entry point that the leadership of the Army could go to. And so that shot group has been tightened up significantly, giving the Army Futures Command authorities, the influence in the enterprise to make decisions associated with our acquisition cycle that will tighten that timeline. But that won't solve it all. I think you're going to find that we ultimately, once we've fixed our house, we'll have to go back, I think, to our civilian authorities and ask for changes in acquisition law, the specifics of which the department will identify later. But we have a culture that sort of worships at the altar of counter-corruption, where we want to legislate a prohibition of that or elimination of that, whereas we might just need to loosen those requirements and then hold accountable those that don't abide by the principles that we all believe in.
So, Gary, this question was directed to you, but I think, Brian, you may have something to add as well, maybe others. What are the 2 top authorities that you assess as critical to have to be delegated to the Joint Task Force Commander? And second part of the question, what lessons on authorities did you take away from your experience with the 101st in Liberia?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. In Liberia, I was supporting the lead federal agency, which was USAID. And so we had a pretty tight mission set of what we had to do. So the authorities were not as challenging. And what was helpful is my direct boss was the AFRICOM commander. So I didn't have a lot of people between me and the problem. But it was a pretty narrow mission set, really supporting USAID and the government of Liberia. But what that did take me to was when I asked questions of who owned that authority, a lot of people couldn't tell me who owned the authorities. So in the 101st, I'd say, if they can't tell me who owns the authorities, I do. And then if I didn't, they'd tell me I didn't. And I think that happened one time. So I had a lot of authorities. Whether I needed them or not, I guess. Some would argue that. I think in this construct, though, when you're fighting a near peer, those authorities are a lot more contentious, because it's all about who owns the risk to execute that thing that you want to do. And in competition phase, when you want more authorities for cyber and for space, you're not going to necessarily get them, because that risk is held at the national level. As the conflict phase went on, we clearly would like more cyber capability and more information operations authorities to do things. I didn't have any issues really shooting at things or destroying things, but to shape and influence things, I had a lot of restrictions too. And so I think that as we demonstrate.
Secondly, that is the cross-balancing or cross-leveling across all components, Reserve, National Guard, and active force, because much of the assets and resources we require for the blunt and contact portion of the force that would be forward position resides in Compo 2 and 3. So when you add up the fact that we've got to build out the echelons above brigade and the Compo 2 and 3 rebalance, I think the order of magnitude of the work associated with that is significant. Now, we've got a design that we've given, and it's a resource-unconstrained design based on multi-domain operations. But right now, we're going through multiple iterations of experimentation to make sure we've got that right. And so it's like adjusting a carburetor, and we're just going to have to continue to do hundreds of turns on these war games and assessments to make sure that we've got the force structure of the future designed correctly.
And if I could just add, that experimentation is not just happening inside battle labs, et cetera. I mean, it goes back to General Wesley's point. Getting the operational force involved in this, actually standing up pilot organizations like the Multi-Domain Task Force, 2-2 Stryker, where we've got the MIEW integrated MICO established. That's key, because it's amazing what happens once you put soldiers and leaders in the loop. You learn, and then you can make smart force structure investments and capability investments. On the training front, there's significant implications across that, because it's not something that we're just ingrained from the second we become into the Army of this is how you're going to be operating. It is a new concept. So one of the things that we've been asked to do by General Valesky is there an on-ramping program course that we can teach folks to get assigned to the multi-domain task force. That's a start, but it's got to go much further than that. It's got to get into PME much more effectively, and it's got to be something where we just naturally operate in this kind of contested and congested environment.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that we've got the best servicemen and women anywhere. And so if you believe that multi-domain operations is just, the MDTF is just a part of it, and competition is where we build success for conflict, our servicemen and women are absolutely critical in doing what they do best, and that's the human dimension that Brian talked about. So getting out, engaging with our partners, developing those relationships, being present, and showing the standards that make our Army and our Department of Defense what it is absolutely critical. So, you know, as we've heard, you know, no one wants to talk to a general. They want to talk to that sergeant because they'll get the truth. And so they will be absolutely critical to this. As far as organization, my argument or offering is that the multi-domain task force should be joint and multinational. If you really want to get after all of the things that we're talking about today, there should be an air component, a maritime component. We've got cyberspace and land already represented, but it should be a gym level kind of organization, because that way you'll be able to get after what John talked about, getting after the speed that you're going to need. I would just tell you that our first I2Q's battalion commander, Derek Bothorn, is here. He is the guy that's standing up right to your left or your right, wherever you're at. He is the guy that has taken this thing for the last 18 months, and with great support from the folks here, has put this whole thing, this movie magic, he's made it all happen. And if you've got really specific questions on I2Q's and the multi-domain task force, I'd ask you to talk to Derek at the break. But sir, I just want to say thanks for helping us get through this panel.
Well, before we express our appreciation to the panel, I'd like to say to this panel, thanks for keeping your comments short and allowing the engagement with the audience. We got through a lot of questions. I think there were maybe two that we didn't, but this really allowed us to have the kind of conversation between all of the attendees. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, General Dubik and General Valesky and General Killo. Thanks especially for wandering into Army land. We very much appreciate it, and all of us think differently. Reception starts now, generously sponsored by General Dynamics Mission Systems, so make sure you give them your thanks. And let's be back here at 1400, please, 1400.